Howdy, and welcome to another episode of Adult Onset Horsemanship. I'm your host, Daniel Dolphin. This is part 2 of our talk with Dr. Sheryl King, Professor Emeritus of Southern Illinois University. We get a little more into reproduction, somewhat into the legislation, the science, the research, and that stuff in this section. So we hope you enjoy it.
Why don't we talk a little bit more about digestion and nutrition and some of the oddities of a horse? So one of the things you had discussed that I really found interesting and appreciated was the incidences of ulcers and some of the facts about feed before exercise and so forth. So would you expound on that a little, please?
Sure. Okay, you had mentioned that the horse's stomach is small, and it is, but it also has two different sections. The top section of a horse's stomach has a whole different lining than the bottom section. And the top section is really designed kind of as a storage area, and it has a few microbes for doing pre-digestion and everything. But it doesn't secrete acid. It's only the lower part of the horse's stomach that secretes acid. And normally when a horse is chewing, the stuff that needs to be exposed to the acid naturally settles to the bottom of the stomach, where it's going to be worked on and then sent along its way. Now, Mother Nature is really good at protecting a body against things that would naturally assault it. If you're producing acid, then you had better have a lining inside your stomach that will protect it against the acid eating away at it. The lower part of a horse's stomach does just that. And there is this little border called the margo plicatus that is the border between the top part of the stomach and the bottom part of the stomach, that normally in a normal horse would serve as a little bit of a physical barrier so that the acid doesn't go up to the top of the horse's stomach, where there is no protective lining. Then you take the way that a horse normally eats, where they're trickle through, there's always something going through their stomach. Well, all that something, that plant material, is absorbing all of that acid and sending it down the rest of the tract. So in a normal, healthy horse, everything's going in one direction, and that acid never has a chance to get up to the top of the stomach. And then you stop feeding the horse. You stop feeding them constantly, so that for a period of 2, 3, 4, even more hours, their stomach is empty. Now, a horse secretes acid in their stomach very differently than a human or a dog. We have to eat before the acid is being produced. So something has to hit our stomach. We're designed to go through periods of starvation, and our stomach won't eat itself. But since Mother Nature created a horse to eat all the time, it said, well, heck, let's just let it produce hydrochloric acid all the time. So whether a horse is eating or not, they're still producing acid. If their stomach is empty, that acid is going to find its way up to the top of the stomach and start eating away at the stomach, and then you get ulcers. The other thing that happens is that actually the natural movement of horses when they are galloping in particular, but moving at speed, trots and faster, because they act like a rocking horse, they're actually physically sloshing some of those hydrochloric acid up into the top of their stomach while they're moving at speed. Okay, so knowing that that is going to happen, you should make sure that the horse has something in their stomach when they're going to exercise. What is it that has been recommended amongst horse people for the longest period of time? If you're going to exercise your horse hard, don't feed it, because it's going to get colic, it's going to get They make up all of these kind of things, which actually aren't true. The only group that actually has it right are the endurance riders. If you ever crewed for an endurance group, they're trying to feed that horse hay constantly. And that is buffering their stomach and keeping something in there. It's also in the lower part of their GI tract, acting as a water reservoir and sucking up the water so that the horse can use it as they're competing. I had said before that I got an introduction to the horse racing industry. And in the thoroughbred horse racing industry in particular, you pull the food and water from a horse about 6 hours before they're going to race.
Oh, goodness.
Because you don't want that extra water weight and you don't want that extra weight in their gut slowing them down. And guess who has the highest incidence of ulcers? About 90% of racehorses have ulcers.
And also stuck in stalls with no turnout time and yes, ma'am.
And all of the other things that contribute.
It's almost like if you designed a recipe book to give a horse ulcers, they're checking off every box.
Sign a racehorse. Absolutely. Absolutely. So for all of you trail riders out there, feed your horse before you go out on a trail ride. If you've got the kind of horse that likes to grab the occasional leaf off of a tree, or when you're stopped or whatever, they like to graze a little bit, let them. It's better for them.
One thing I find, or that I believe anyway, is that a lot of people don't understand what an ulcer really is. And it's essentially just a sore. So a horse, if you don't have their dental care done properly in their mouth, they'll get a sharp point on their tooth, which will rub into their cheek and will cause a sore, which we call an ulcer. And in their gut, it's essentially the same sort of thing. The hydrochloric acid splashes onto the top part, and it does that enough. It eats through the lining a little bit, and we have a sore, or the same thing in the hind gut. One of the anatomical oddities of horses is that they do not have a gallbladder, and their saliva sort of takes the place of that. Would you mind talking about that a little bit? Because saliva is one of those rabbit holes I went deep down on my bit research, and I really feel like there's a correlation between some of the bit problems we have and ulcers as well for that reason, but I'll let you.
Horses produce a lot of spit. Okay. During the course of the day, probably around 6 gallons of spit. So that's a lot of spit. And horse saliva contains a rather high concentration of bicarbonate. And anybody that knows anything about baking soda knows that it's a really good buffer. Okay. So that means every time a horse swallows, they're bathing their stomach in this buffer that's helping to buffer the hydrochloric acid that's being produced. And then that's moving on down the horse's GI tract. The other thing that's unique about horses and saliva is that horses only produce saliva, or they only salivate when they're chewing. So the whole idea about Pavlov's dogs, and showing them some food and getting them to salivate in response to it, works on a dog, works on a human, won't work on a horse. You have to put food in their mouth. So put a bit in their mouth, get them to chew on the bit, put food in their mouth. They will be bathing their GI tract in this beneficial bicarbonate. The idea being that horses are always chewing, so Mother Nature took care of that situation. People would say, well, that doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense for a horse only to salivate when they're chewing. Why don't they salivate when they even think about food? Well, it's because a horse is designed to always chew. So not a big deal. And you're right, they don't have a gallbladder, but they do have bile. And their bile just is produced at a steady rate, just like saliva would be. And it's secreted into their their upper GI tract into their small intestine at about 300 milliliters an hour. Horses don't need a gallbladder because what are gallbladders used for? They're basically for emulsifying fats, and horses don't eat a high-fat diet, So, yeah, if they were carnivores and they were about to chow down on a big old fatty piece of meat, you need a gallbladder to be able to squish a whole bunch of bile into the GI tract right when that fat is hitting it. But with horses, their normal diet is so low in fat that they don't need that fail-safe mechanism.
Well,
on the other hand, this goes way back to dinosaur again. This is my dinosaur memory. Back when I first started school, we learned horses had no gallbladders and everything. Ergo, correlation again, ergo, that would mean that horses can't digest fats. We found out later on through nutritional studies, horses digest fats pretty efficiently if we give it to them. The idea being then that, the really high performance horses, rather than feeding them the carbs, a better way to get the energy to them and protect the integrity of their GI tract is to start upping the amount of fats that we put in their diet, because they're more calorically dense and they do a better job of protecting the GI tract. So I went way off on a tangent, and I am not a nutritionist. If you want to talk about horse sex, I can tell you all about that.
Well, I just wanted to bring this up because I've talked pretty in depth with Dr. Jeff Tucker on this as well. So another oddity of a horse's digestive tract is that they have a cecum, which is sort of this pouch back there between that I always heard in school that God made all of the animals and then he made the horse's digestive tract out of spare parts that were left over, and there's some truth to that. But
yep.
So the cecum in a horse is specifically designed, we call them hindgut fermenters, and it breaks down through bacteria and fungi and single cell yeast and molds and those sorts of things, break down cellulose. So most monogastrics, like humans, we cannot break down fiber, which is part of how our body benefits from fiber and why it scrubs us clean and all of that good stuff. But horses actually can. And correct me if I'm wrong, but what they break fiber down into is fatty acids.
Mostly, yeah.
So that's one of those things I've always found counterintuitive, is that when we're feeding some of that low quality forage, what we're actually giving them there is what they break it down into is fat. Now, they don't do that on a high volume scale. Like you say, the cecum is, I think, only about a gallon in size. It's not real big and it can only do so much, but it's part of the journey, is to break down otherwise undigestible material into fat, essentially. So my thought
is very large.
It is large?
Oh, yeah. It's about 10 to 12 gallons.
Oh,
so
wow.
It is about 4 feet long. It's huge.
Dang. Okay.
And between the cecum and the first part of the large intestine, that's where all those microbes are located that are designed to break down cellulose. The horse just did it ass backwards compared to ruminant animals who do it at the beginning, and the horses do it at the end. Horses and rabbits.
Yes, ma'am.
Why a rabbit eats its own poop.
Gets the culture of the microbacteria back up. Yes, ma'am.
Digested at the end of their tract and then have to re-eat it.
So from a horse ingesting something to pooping it out the end, they're relatively quick on moving it through. Is that how long does that take, essentially, from start to finish?
From start to finish, it takes probably, it's extremely variable depending on fiber size and a whole bunch of stuff, but between 12 and 48 hours. But pretty lickety split. Within 24 hours, and then when you're doing nutrition studies and everything, you actually feed them stuff that has inert dyes in it, and that way you can see when the dye is coming out the other end and see how the rate of passage going through there. And most of the time it's within about 12 hours, it's out the other end. It's pretty quick.
That's unreal.
One of the other interesting things about cecums, or hindgut fermentation, is because the sequence of the organs are backwards from ruminants in horses. That is why horses are so much more sensitive to potential toxins in their foods and molds and things like that compared to ruminant animals. Okay. All of those microbes that are in their lower GI tract, they're the decontamination center. They will eat all of those toxins and turn them into things that are non-toxic to be absorbed. Okay. In a ruminant animal, the rumen has the microbes. It's one of the first sections of the stomach, so they can decontaminate their food before it gets to the small intestine where everything is absorbed into the bloodstream. In horses, everything has to go through the GI tract, go through the small intestine, everything gets absorbed, and then it hits the cecum where it's decontaminated. So you feed a horse and a cow moldy food, the horse will get sick, the cow will not. Okay. Same thing with a lot of things that could be potential toxins to herbivores. It will affect a horse and it will not affect most of the other herbivores. Just has to do with the sequence of the digestive organs.
Is that also like you hear a lot of times about not changing a horse's feed types quickly and so forth? Does that play a role in that as well?
The microbes in the cecum and the large intestine, we're talking about hundreds of billions of these things. They are specifically adapted. The relative populations of all of them are specifically adapted to whatever food the horse is eating. And the turnover rate is really quite fast. So if you change a horse's diet and microbe A that's designed to digest oat hay, let's say, we're going to simplify this. All of a sudden you switch to alfalfa, those microbes are going to die. They're no longer needed, okay? But the microbes that can eat the alfalfa haven't had time to increase their population yet. So you've caused a mass die-off of some microbes, not enough of the other microbes, boom, you got stomach upset. Well, GI upset, it's not their stomach. It happens actually, what horse people don't understand is it happens on a micro level as well. It only takes about 6 hours for a horse's GI tract, their microbes, to respond to whatever food they're eating. So a lot of horse people, if you're feeding grass hay and alfalfa hay, right? They might feed the grass hay in the morning and feed them the alfalfa at night, or vice versa. What you're actually doing on a micro level is constantly changing those microbial populations. And within 6 hours of feeding one, their microbes are starting to respond and saying, oh, no alfalfa coming through, you guys can leave. And then the alfalfa comes through. So that's not setting the horse up necessarily for being sick, but it is setting the horse up for not digesting and absorbing the maximum amount of nutrients that they could out of their feed. So if you're going to feed your horse a regular grass hay and alfalfa, mix it at every single feeding.
I like we're getting into some of this stuff. I'm bringing back the ulcers, if you don't mind, because there's kind of a theory that I have there that I wanted to run by you. So I believe that part of the puzzle of performance horses has to do with the way that we ride them. And one of the big things that I like to talk about is when we see saliva outside of the horse's mouth, and the foamy white mouth. And I don't know how complicated I want to get on that right now, but behaviorally, that's significant in what it means in terms of the nervous system, because if a horse switches from the parasympathetic nervous system to the sympathetic nervous system, one of the first things that happens is digestion shuts off, so they will stop producing saliva.
Yeah.
And for me, one of the significant portions of that is that also means that the horse stops swallowing. And I did a lot of research, fruitless research, looking for a physiological connection between swallowing and relaxation and anxiety. And I'm absolutely convinced that that connection exists, but I don't think the research specifically in horses has been done to confirm it. And some of the collaborators I had on that project were speech pathologists, because as I've shared with you, I had a lot of difficulty finding information on the tongue in horses. And so I went to human experts to try to extrapolate as much as I could. And speech pathologists are absolute experts on the tongue and the throat and things that occur in that area. So I'm absolutely convinced that the salivation, the swallowing and all is intimately connected in that transition of parasympathetic to sympathetic and vice versa. And in fact, what Dr. Steve Peters has told me is that what we see as the lick and chew, that we correlate with a release of dopamine, the reason we see it is because when we come back from the sympathetic nervous system into the parasympathetic nervous system, the ninth cervical nerve, which is responsible for digestion, kicks back in and we get a release of saliva, and the horse then processes that saliva and swallows it, and we visually see licking and chewing. And we know that that transition from sympathetic back to parasympathetic correlates with a release of dopamine. So I tell you all of that just because we're nerds, and I think some people might appreciate it. But it's my belief that when we ride a horse in such a way that we put them in the sympathetic nervous system, and we didn't do that for an hour, hour and a half, or whatever, we interrupt salivation and swallowing, and thus we have a chunk of the horse's day where none of that bicarbonate went through the digestive system. And I certainly think there's a lot more that plays into the role of or the cause of ulcers, but I think that's got to play a part in and of itself. Maybe not a huge role, maybe it's 10% or 15% of the picture or something, but I do think it's a part of the picture. I would love to see some research one day more specifically on swallowing and that stuff. When I was doing the research for the project, that was an area where every expert I talked to, I could relatively quickly ask questions they could no longer answer. We just don't have the full picture. And I know you and I have talked about, let's get into horses are obligate nose breathers, and that ties into the way their respiration and digestion occurs, ties into the fact that we have colic in horses and we don't see that in other animals. So would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Okay, prompt me.
Well, like, for instance, if horses could burp, then we wouldn't have colic, or a lot of the instances of colic wouldn't exist. But because of the way their system is a one-way street, it only goes down. And then you and I have talked a little bit. I wasn't really able to help you, but we had discussed about the larynx and horses making sounds and some of that stuff. And I can delete all this.
I actually found the answer to, and you were right. They can breathe out of their mouth a little bit if it's forceful. So yeah, when they're whinnying, air is coming out their mouth. So yeah.
But it's a breaking that seal in the back of the soft pellet and epiglottis.
Now, how they break that seal is something that I would love to find out. You know, again, so if you ever find somebody that wants to do some swallowing research, I would love to ask them about, can you look at a horse while it's whinnying too?
It would be interesting. I don't think most people have a grasp on how much about horses we still don't know. That there really are just a lot of unanswered questions still, which is exciting for any young people that might be going into this field, because there's still a whole lot of ground to plow out there in front of y'all. It is definitely ripe with answers to find.
There sure is.
Well, we've talked about colic and correlation and causation and digestion and nutrition. We've got a kinky horse sex specialist here, so we might as well get into that a little bit too. And hey, as we're taping this, we're at the start of breeding season essentially. So what are some cool horse sex facts for us? I'll give you a minute to think, and I'll tell a funny story.
Okay,
I recently had a customer who was new to horses and wanted me to come out to their place and kind of look. And they had a 2-year-old filly and a 3-year-old stallion that were out there in the paddock and together. And they had been breeding. She had just gotten them. Well, it so happened the filly is in heat. And the lady thought that horses, like people, had sex all the time for fun just because. And so I had to have a horse sex ed talk with an adult and explain cycling and that sort of stuff, which I found a little funny and a little awkward and all, but it actually prompted me, like, maybe I'll do a video sort of explaining the estrus cycle and that they don't just randomly have sex, that there's a pattern to it and all, because while some of us that might be obvious, to other people obviously it's not. So
exactly. Yeah, again, looking at it from the human perspective. So. That did give me time to think. Thank you. Seasonality, you would hit on seasonality. Okay, horses are backwards from most other wild herbivores when it comes to the season during which they're sexually active. And that has to do with the very prolonged gestation that horses have, 11 months to produce a foal. So to produce a foal during the time when that mare is going to have access to the richest food source to produce the best milk for her foal, she has to foal in the spring, or the summer, which means that's the time when they're supposed to be cycling as well, which is kind of backwards from sheep and goats and cows and everything else, because they have a shorter gestation period. So everything is backwards. And like you said, it's almost like God decided on the 8th day that he wanted to get creative, and he said, let's throw away the rule book and create a horse. So that gave me carte blanche to study this animal that is backwards in its approach to almost everything. But let's cycle back to the idea of the natural horse versus the highly managed domestic horse, okay? And one of the things we're seeing, for years I looked at seasonality in mares. And one of the things that we're seeing is that domestic, highly managed horses are less seasonal than they used to be. And I think that has to do with 100 years of selecting for trying to breed them during the non-breeding season. Okay. Should I explain this? Is this
Sure.
something that the people listening wouldn't understand?
No, I go ahead. I think that would be a good thing to say out loud. Some will know, but I guarantee you some wouldn't. So.
Okay. So horses, mares normally only cycle in the spring and the summertime. That's the only time they're capable of reproducing. Then humans start getting involved. And back in the 1800s, actually over in England, when they are racing and competing horses against one another, they needed to find a better way to equalize the playing field and race similar aged horses against one another. And this becomes really important when you're racing at a young age, 2-year-olds, okay? So then in all of their wisdom, these humans decided, well, okay, what we'll do instead of having to try to have all of these owners and trainers bring us their registration papers for their horses, which could be falsified back then pretty easily, no DNA testing or anything else, so that we can put like-aged horses together. Let's just universally declare that all horses are a year older at some arbitrary date. And let's pick January 1st, since that's the beginning of the calendar year for us. So what you have automatically done is create an incentive system whereby you try to breed mares in February, so they'll produce a January foal, so that that foal has a 2 or 3 or even 6-month advantage over another foal that's born when they're supposed to be born, when they're racing as 2-year-olds. Okay? So you've really put a monkey wrench in the reproductive system. And you have put the onus on scientists like me to try to find a way to fool Mother Nature and get that mare to think that it's spring when it's really the middle of the wintertime, and breed them out of their natural breeding season. So I can't tell you how much money, a whole heck of a lot of money, and many, many hundreds of hours of research, thousands of hours of research, have gone into trying to find methods to breed mares outside of their breeding season. Would have been a lot easier to just change the universal birth date to March 1st, but we're humans, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, one of the things that we're seeing, though, is if you go back, say, to Mustangs or to Shetland ponies or to horses that are less managed by humans over a number of generations, you compare their seasonality to the seasonality of our domestic horses, particularly our thoroughbreds, standardbreds, quarter horses, stuff like that, where there is a significant incentive to breed them early, is the highly domesticated horses are losing some of their seasonality. There is, depending on the year and everything else, there's about 30% of those mares that cycle year round.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to the wild type, which, they're not going to start cycling till April, most of the time. So that's one way that humans can mess up the most basic biology of horses. It's absolutely fascinating that in a relatively few number of generations, we can have a pretty profound effect on Mother Nature just by selection pressure.
So I'll tell on myself here. I have always witnessed mares that a certain percentage of them, like you say, a third is probably a fair number, cycle year round. I never realized how unnatural that was. To me, that's just one of those things that you see sometimes. And I kind of figured part of it is because I'm so far south, we don't get as cold a winter. But mares, of course, are linked to light, not to cold. So that should have already dinged in my head. That's interesting.
And it probably also has to do with the way that we're feeding them as well. I mean, yes. Some of the research that we did and other researchers did, trying to figure out why these mares are cycling all year long, with the idea of how to create more of them for the industry. I know, you go where the money is, right? Was to say, well, they're obviously domesticated. They're obviously animals that at one point in time were competing and then retired to the breeding shed. So they probably got the benefit of different nutrition than your average ranch horse or wild horse or whatever. How does that nutrition play into it over the long term? And that's a really hard thing to tease out. But if I were a betting person, I would bet that nutrition plays into this as well.
I'm kind of wondering, just a spur of the moment thought here, but I'm not really aware, maybe you are, but if we had any feral or wild herds that were more equatorial, if there would be less of a seasonality component, but I'm not really aware of any well-known horse bands that are equatorial. They tend to be, at least at this time, evolutionarily, of course. I recently learned, it might have been from one of your posts, that there were horses in the Americas pre-Bering Strait and all that actually went extinct. And so the Columbus introduction of the Spanish barb horses was actually a reintroduction in North America, but they had been here thousands or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years ago, long time ago, whatever it was. I found that pretty interesting. There's also a guy I follow in falconry who's a wildlife biologist by trade, and I had no idea that pre-Ice Age and all, there were camels in North America.
Yeah, I was going to say that camels, rhinoceros, elephant, horses, they all evolved in North America. And then during the Ice Age went extinct here, but luckily survived over in Eurasia. So we still have them, or at least we have them now.
Our thought process of traditional often tends to be pretty short-sighted, and
yes.
What was a little before what we're thinking of might have been radically different. So,
another little tidbit where reproduction for public consumption is concerned, going back to me being a dinosaur, okay? When I began work in horse reproduction, it was before they even had ultrasound machines. I mean, we had mimeograph machines back then. That's how old I am. Anyway, once ultrasound machines were invented and got much better, we started discovering a lot more about the inner workings of horses than we ever suspected before. We did know that there is a certain number of mares, a certain percentage, about 20 to 30% of mares, that will chronically produce more than one egg every cycle, okay? They have a tendency to twin more often. Now, in horses, their biology does not allow them to produce viable twins. If she brings twins to term, very often they'll both be born dead. So you don't want that to happen. So the traditional reasoning back when I first started, and the only way you can tell what was going on in their reproductive tract was to go in there and feel through their rectal wall, is if they were producing more than one egg, you wouldn't breed them that cycle. Okay, because you didn't want the chance of her conceiving twins, particularly if she had had a history of doing that in the past. Thoroughbreds have the highest twinning rate. It's about 30%. Anyway, then we got ultrasound machines and start being able to see these tiny little conceptuses when they were only 12 days old. They look like tiny little glass beads on an ultrasound machine. And we can see what was happening. And the cool thing that we found out is these mares that will multiple ovulate and conceive, produce more eggs and conceive to twins. She has, Mother Nature is a wonderful thing, a natural selection mechanism within her uterus. So those, actually her oviducts at that point. So those two embryos kind of lodge next to each other. And then the mare's system allows one to engulf the other and eat it, basically. And you end up with a singleton pregnancy. So the entire thinking from when I started to when I ended my reproductive career went 180. Back when I started, if you had multiple follicles, multiple eggs developing, you wouldn't breed that mare. Now, if she's got multiple eggs developing, you do, because her chances of coming up with a singleton pregnancy are actually higher than if she were producing one egg at a time.
I know it's very rare, but is that also how we have a chimera, or chimera is
yes.
through
yes.
that process? So
usually what happens is that assimilation between the two twins happens later when they're well into their development beyond the blastocyst stage. And then one will engulf the other, but they retain two different sets of DNA within the same fold. Now, when DNA codes for every single cell in our body, and it tells us to produce eyeballs or hair follicles or toes or what have you. So if one DNA is says you're going to be a sorrel, and the other DNA says, no, you're going to be black, you'll end up with hair being a mixture of both sorrel and black, depending on what twins' DNA got turned on to produce that piece of hair. It's really cool. And different parts of their body, too. That actually was a case in humans. Sorry, I'm going to digress here, but this was so cool. This woman was on support, child assistance. She had 2 children. She had to, and in order to qualify for this assistance, you have to prove that that child is biologically yours. Okay, so they did DNA tests on her and everything, and the child's DNA did not match her DNA from a cheek swab. So they said, I'm sorry, you're trying to game the system. This isn't your kid. We're not going to give you support. And she goes, what do you mean? Of course, they came out of my body. I was there. That's my child. They wouldn't believe her, wouldn't give her support. Well, in the meantime, she got pregnant again. And for this 3rd child, she insisted that witnesses be there at the birth. So they were there. They witnessed the birth. They did a DNA test. Voila, the child's DNA did not match her DNA. This baby you just pushed out is not yours. Well, yeah, it is. And they finally, after years of her having to fight this in court and everything, figured out that the woman was a chimera. And the DNA that formed the inside of her cheek was different from the DNA that made her ovaries. So the baby would have different DNA than what she came up with. And that happens in horses too. I was just thinking about that the other day, okay? If a mare is a chimera, okay, and the DNA usually they either do a blood test or they pull some mane hair to do a DNA test in horses. Say her ovaries were different DNA from her mane, okay? They would reject that foal and say that foal is not that mare's foal. So how do you go about registering that foal?
Mm-hmm. I haven't heard of a case of that, but it seems like it's inevitable that it's going to occur.
It could happen.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay, weird science. Now we're getting into weird science. Sorry.
Yeah, and most of the time when we think of a chimera, we are thinking of the hair follicles, like you say, where there's an obvious odd pattern and a little red flags going off in your head that, maybe. But if you had a sorrel that, nothing visually would ding that bell, that could leave you scratching for sure. And of course, at least within the quarter horse world, there are many old myths of this stallion that was famous went sterile, and so they started breeding this other stallion and registering them, so there are already holes in our DNA game there.
Yes.
Well, I guess we've been at this for a little while. I'll just ask you one final question.
Is this going to be an off the wall one?
No. This is on research resources. Do you have, for anyone that is science minded and would like to learn? I know I've run across some walls in my own search for research there. So college professors tend to have access to things that normal lay people don't necessarily have access to. So I'll give a tip right there. I have had pretty good success emailing total stranger college professors at a college I never went to and saying, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. Could you help me out? And probably 70% of the time they've responded and been as helpful as they could be. So I'll give y'all that tip right there. Bother the hell out of all these college professors.
My email blows up.
Yes, but do you have any specific places you would send people or tips for them?
Yeah, the first tip is don't believe what you read on Google. Okay, if you Google something, that is your starting point, and make the mental assumption that it's probably about 60% leading you down a path that is untrue or partially true. Fact check, always. And that does not mean go further down the Google search engine, because they've got algorithms, you have to pay attention to the URLs, somebody's trying to sell you something. If I'm trying to fact check something, the first and easiest thing I do is I go to Google Scholar instead of Google. And I have it right on my toolbar at the top of my computer. So what Google Scholar will do is it throws out all that extraneous, the URLs that are trying to sell you something, and it gives you the science-based stuff. Now, for your average layperson, they may click on it and say, I can't understand a word of what they're saying, but usually these papers will give you a summary or an abstract at the beginning that you can pretty much digest and understand, okay? A lot of them at this point, you'll hit a paywall. The scientific papers, you have to pay to get the full paper. And that's where I suspect you got in touch with a college professor that works at that has access to a university library, so we can just go in and get these things. Another search engine that's good is called PubMed. If you get something technical, particularly if you're trying to look at a medication or you're trying to look at anything in the nutritional chemistry area, like your bicarbonate in the saliva and stuff, try a PubMed search. There's lots of science and technical kind of search engines, but those are the two that I use probably most often that will answer the question, is what I'm reading on Google BS, or does it have some merit? So
I guess one other question that I'll ask you here, and we may be on opposite sides of the fence on this one, but
we're on several things, but that's okay.
Yeah. Well, I find a lot of research that I look at isn't necessarily as scientific as we might want it to be. Sometimes you read through it and you find that, there may well be some bias in here once you, like you say, have back checked things a little bit. Or I have also found where the abstract said one thing, but then when I actually dug into the paper and looked at the numbers, it maybe wasn't as evident. I wouldn't have written the conclusion the same way as they wrote the conclusion, I guess is maybe how I'll put that. So right. Do you have any, or would you agree with that? You seem from your facial expressions like you understand exactly what I'm saying here. That's why we have
my brain is saying that's the fault of the editors and the reviewers, that there are some journals that are more reliable than others.
Yeah, that's why we have the peer-reviewed system, because we don't want somebody to throw something out there as fact that other people look at and go, hey, you have some obvious holes in your methodology there, or whatever. So if someone wanted, I'll be the first to say that when I'm reading some of these research papers, I have to look words up at times, and maybe less so now that I've digested a bunch of them, but certainly in the beginning,
sure.
They like multi-syllable, eight line long sentences, and it's not the easiest read for sure. And then statistics, I've had statistics, so I'm a little more comfortable with the math there, but to some people statistics might sound like a foreign language when they first start reading it. So do you have any advice or tips or anything for a layperson who may want to dive down that rabbit hole a little bit, not to get discouraged too easily? Or
yeah, patience. I still look up words, thank goodness for computers. It makes it a lot easier to look up words now than it ever was before. And sometimes you have to be patient enough to take it sentence by sentence. And it's almost like you're translating, well, you are translating a foreign language of sorts. It's the language of science instead of a regular foreign language, but it's the same kind of thing for somebody who isn't conversant in that language. The more you do it, the better you get at it. And you learn the lingo. most of the lingo you can parse out too, because if you know, most of it is Latin terms. So if you know the root and what it means, I know that sounds really cerebral and everything else, but it helps you so much. You can figure out what a word actually means if you know just a little smattering of Latin. So pay attention to that. When you're looking up a word, don't just look at the definition, look at the etymology of the word, where it came from and what this part of the word means and what that part of the word means, and eventually it'll start making sense. The other thing is, even in science, going back to what you're saying and the less reputable journals, they're out there. Almost all journals now have ratings. So you can go in and actually, through either Google Scholar or Google, you can look at the relative ratings of any particular journal. And it will tell you how reputable they are. Now, obviously, the Iranian Journal of Aeronautical Engineers is not going to be something that we will naturally think is probably too rigorous. Science, Nature, all of those kind of journals are very, very reputable. So, yeah, you can look at their rankings and their ratings. And if it's something way, way down there, then take it with a grain of salt and look up another, use your search engine and look up something else and see whether the same topic comes up completely 180 in a different journal.
Yes, ma'am. What about things like sample size when you look at some of the math and you realize that all of this new conclusion that has debunked hundreds of years of knowledge was done on a sample of 4 horses or something like that?
I got to defend the horse industry. It's really hard to do research in horses. They're big animals. They eat a lot. They're expensive to have around. And there's very little funding for doing horse research out there. With all that said, and you try to pull as much information as you can from as small and sample size as you can. But, you get down to a critical size, and 4 animals does not represent an entire population.
Yes,
or it may, but the chances of that happening or not happening are rather large. So, yeah, you got to take that kind of stuff and be aware of it as well. To get into the technical side of things, and you may want to edit this out, but there's actually different kinds of technical papers. There is a controlled research study where they take a group of animals or humans or whatever subjects, and they have a control population where they don't do the treatment to, and they have treatment populations, and they have an endpoint that they measure, and they compare between those 2 populations to see whether what you're testing had any effect, okay? There are, in the medical journals and the veterinary journals, one of my pet peeves here is there are case studies, which is an N of 1. Here's an interesting horse case that we had, and it had colic because it had the most ginormous enterolith I've ever seen in my life. And this person got to write a paper on it, but there's an N of 1. So case studies don't believe universally. They're just telling you about interesting medical phenomena that happened. The last one are review studies. And I've been just writing a paper the last several nights, and I came across this really cool review study. But what these do is they take all the research that's out there in the computerverse and they synthesize it for you. And they say, okay, on the topic of colic caused by enterolith in horses, here's all the research that we found, and this is the general consensus of what all of that research came up with. I love review research. And for the layperson trying to read up on a topic, a review paper, which it will say right up at the top of the paper, review, is probably the easiest one to digest.
Sure. And then your sample size is much greater. You're now drawing from lots of things and looking for what was consistent, and what might not have been consistent we're regarding. And there was one other thing I kind of feel compelled to say. A lot of the research that you'll find or you'll see some dewormers and so forth that won't be listed for lactating mares or pregnant mares. And part of that is because when they're doing the research, it's a lot harder to come across those horses it adds a layer of complexity, I guess, to the actual research. So there's always less research done on that. Or breeding stallions don't necessarily tend to get donated a whole lot for you because they tend to be kind of valuable, and so you don't get to just roll the dice and see what happens with an $80,000 thoroughbred. You tend to have to deal with the group that you've got. So sometimes when you see specific exclusions like that, it doesn't mean that this wormer doesn't work miraculously for some reason on stallions. It means that we didn't have stallions to test this on, and so we can't definitively tell you, but probably you're going to be okay. So there are some oddities like that out there.
Exactly.
Well, I think we have covered a lot of ground today. I've enjoyed
this horse.
Is there anything you would like to say that we haven't covered that you just want to make sure you get in there? Or
no, well, when we're talking about myths and folklore and everything else in the horse industry, it's just very, very pervasive, So my advice to horse people out there, particularly if you're just being introduced into the horse industry, you're a newbie, you're going to learn from other horse people. They're going to repeat what they've heard. I would say question everything. That's a good policy.
I could not agree more. That is absolutely true there.
And I've found the people like you or like me, or the people that have integrity in the industry and are always searching for the right answer, not necessarily the quick fix. When somebody asks you or doubts you or asks you to explain something, you don't resent it. You welcome the opportunity to educate. And if somebody is coming up through the ranks and learning in the horse industry and they ask questions and the person they're asking the question of becomes annoyed and defensive, that should be a red flag to you.
I would agree. Yes, ma'am. And unfortunately, those people tend to be happy to talk to the newbies. A lot of times it almost takes 10 years before you cycle through the misinformation to getting to some actual decent knowledge, because the people that catch the newbies tend to be the ones that are spreading this stuff for whatever reason. But anyway, it's job security, right?
Yes, it is.
Well, Dr. King, I certainly appreciate you coming on. I have thoroughly enjoyed chatting with you as always. I'm sitting here, I could have written down 10 more topics for us to get on to. Maybe at some point in the future we could have you back on if you'd consent. I would love to talk to you with your experience and all about some of the legislative matters and some of those things. And I think we could probably do a whole session just on that. But I know that also can get into some controversial topics and so forth. I don't know if you want to tackle that, bear with me or not, but if you do in the future, I would be happy to do it. So,
well, I've learned how to tiptoe through some of those topics, but it's topics that need to be discussed, and it's facts that need to get out there so that people are armed with the truth and they can make their own decisions about things. But yeah, I would like that. I would welcome that opportunity. Okay.
Well, that sounds good. I'll ruminate on that a little bit in the back of my head, and we're kind of in a whole new legislative season. So I'm looking to see, like, the PAST Act made it past committee last year, but didn't make it to vote. It happened right in December. And so I don't know if that's going to show back up this year or not. I don't know if you have a lot of.
They've actually changed the wording that I was adamantly opposed to.
Yes, ma'am.
So now I feel less strongly about it. And I do feel strongly that we need to protect those poor animals in the gaited horse industry. How to go about it and not impact other parts of the industry is the conundrum.
Well, I don't mean to open a whole other can of worms, but do you believe that the problem does persist, or do you? I'm not in that world, so I don't know, and I'm hearing it both ways. I guess the human side of me would like to believe that that's not really going on, but I've also been in the horse business for a while, and I've seen some things that I couldn't believe that people were doing on more than an occasion or two. So do you, in your experience, and you can say I don't really know or whatever, do you think that the soaring, as we colloquially know it, because that's part of what you and I were objecting to, is they were trying to change the definition of what that was to something that was impossible for the industry to exist with. Do you think that the problem really does exist? I guess is what I'm saying.
I do.
Okay.
Part of it has to do with the way the current regulations are enforced or not enforced. Part of it has to do with, in any aspect of human competition, there's going to be cheaters, people that try to get to their endpoint by nefarious means. So we're fighting against human nature. And part of it has to do with that small niche, and that's a relatively small niche within the horse industry, those big lick horses, who they're owned by and where the power structure is. And when I talk to some of my friends that are associated with that part of the industry, some of the feedback that I get and some of the stories are truly scary. Well, I would say on the horse side, yeah, because some of the stuff they do to that horses, and they're getting more sophisticated all the time, but it has to do with the other side of it and the power of the owners and the extent to which they will go to make sure that their horses remain competitive. So that's kind of scary. So yeah, it's still something that needs to be addressed, in my opinion. But again, how to go about it so that it doesn't impact the people in other gated show parts of the industry that aren't soaring their horses. That's a tough thing to thread.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, that's the part of it that scares me the most is when they make blanket changes to something like the USDA, and then it just takes one sentence change later, and all of a sudden everybody's under the hat of that rather than just the group they were looking at. And unfortunately, we have precedents of changes like that being made in the past, and that's part of it that I really fear. And those are the sorts of things that a bureaucrat decides. They don't get voted on. We don't have any influence over. They just change something in the APHIS structure, and boom, now we all have to live under the ramifications of it. And that's a scary proposition to me, knowing some of the other things that I know. So
who is advising them and who is whispering in their ear too, which scares me.
Yes, ma'am. For sure. Like we were talking about.
I are absolutely on the same page here, but yeah, the groups that are gaining power and voice in the animal industry in general, be it horses, dogs, cats, whatever. Yeah, they're scary.
Yes, ma'am. So, well, I guess there's the teaser for episode 2.0 anyway. So, Well, again, thank you very much for your time this morning. I greatly appreciate it. I hope I haven't wasted too much of your day. We went like 2.5 hours. This is going to be one of my ones too. Time flies when you're talking to Daniel. It's just great. So, well, I wish I had a website or something to send them to. I've been trying to get you to do like a business Facebook page or something like that.
I have to look into that. Yeah, I should.
Because you got such good information, and that way it would be accessible to everybody rather than just your personal friend group. I've shared a bunch of stolen your memes and put them on my business page where people can see it that way. But I would, if you do decide to make that change shortly, let me know, and that way I can put it in the show notes where people can have access to the information you put out, because it's always entertaining or educational or both. I think they're all worth looking at. So,
well, this concludes part 2 of my interview with Dr. Sheryl King. She did indeed go on to create a page which is now up. It is on Facebook and called Simply Horses. We will put a link to that page in the show notes, so check it out. We'll also have a link to our Facebook group, Bits, Spurs, and Good Sense. And as always, if you have not already given this podcast a rating or a comment, review, whatever your directory allows, we would certainly appreciate you doing that. Or tell some friends about it, share it with some friends, and help us to grow the audience and bring the information and message that we have to more and more people in the horse world. Thank you much. We'll see you next week for another episode of Adult Onset Horsemanship. I've been your host, Daniel Dolphin.